Good day to you. Intercultural communication. Intercultural communication. Communication between cultures. That's what we've been studying in this class as we seek to wrap things up today with Chapter 14 on future challenges to intercultural communication. But first, let's just make note that overall, the improvement in the human condition across the world has been pretty amazing these last 10, 20, 30 years. The book has chronicled some of those changes, improvements in health, improvements in understandings of people, improvements of health insurance. Overall, the world is, we can probably say fairly objectively, getting better, and yet there's still a lot of work to do. There is one error in the beginning of the book just because it came to print before this latest change in the economic situation. That is, China is now the world's largest economy. It passed the U.S. in the spring of this year. We know that in the past, people were separated largely by distance. If you lived in Canada and you lived in Argentina, odds are you weren't going to cross paths unless you made a special trip to go to one of those countries, and there's not a lot of history of intercommerce between those two countries. But today, people aren't so separated because of social media and also because travel has become much easier. You can book your own and it's cheaper. So the new contact zone, if you remember that term from both this chapter and chapter 13, contact zone. A contact zone is where people who normally wouldn't come into the same contact with each other, it's where they come into the same space. It can be a virtual space or it can be a physical space. The new contact zone is largely in social media. We're talking about texting, we're talking about social media sites such as Snapchat, Facebook, etc. We're talking about emailing. People can cross paths. When you think about how many Facebook friends you have, probably you have a Facebook account, how many of them are foreign people from other countries? Probably a lot more than somebody your age 40 years ago, 50 years ago, unless you were a big world traveler. And that's largely because of Facebook. Every single day I've got a post coming at me from my friend in Sweden, one coming from Britain, one from Mexico. It's like a little world within Facebook. All right, now that we've considered sort of the setup of this chapter, let's move on to some of the major barriers to communication that Fred Yant believes exists. And the first one that he cites is religion. Traditionally, there have been epic struggles between Christians and Muslims, Hindus and Muslims, believers and non-believers. We see a lot of war. We see a lot of pestilence. We see a lot of angst, a lot of anger, a lot of resistance to new country formation. Religion, though in its purest form, is about the worship of a god for the betterment of the human soul. I guess that would be my definition. In actual practicality, it's shown itself to be a rather divisive force in this world. You even have divisions between religions that otherwise would seemingly be alike, like Catholics and Lutherans often are at odds with each other, even though they come from the same branch or division of religion. So religion continues to be an impediment overall to communication between cultures. Next up is class. Class also continues to be a big problem. There are so many statistics given on this item in the chapter, but some of the highlights which really show the disparity in wealth across the world is, here's one. 1% of the world's population controls 46% essentially of the world's wealth. 1% controls almost half of the world's wealth. That's a big disparity, and it would breed a lot of resentment, and it would keep a lot of people down if it continues like that. Also, the U.S. has 46%, almost half, of super wealthy people, multi-millionaires, almost half. That's why so many people want to move to the U.S. if they are money-oriented. More on the basic survival side of the equation, though, we know that world hunger is pretty prevalent. There's a billion people across the world who cannot feed themselves. I don't mean lifting a fork. I mean they can't afford food and they can't grow it because of where they live. That's a big problem. When you have that kind of economic disparity, you're going to have people that continue to want to move to places in large numbers. You're going to have crime. You're going to have resentment. You're going to have discontent. Next up is a potential barrier that still exists is gender. We know that women, generally speaking, are on the shorter end of the stick still, even though progress has been made. There still is discrimination against women. We know that the United Nations has taken up this cause and has issued several directives and initiatives, for example, to prevent or even eliminate violence against women is a goal. More violence occurs against women than violence occurs by women against men. It's one of the dimensions of discrimination. We know that about 1 in 6 women will be a victim of sexual abuse. You have only to pick up the newspaper almost every single day here, the Pocono Record, and almost every single day there's a story about a female who's been abused at a young age, including today, a 6-year-old girl, if you read the Pocono Record. So gender continues until there's equality, will continue to be a barrier between intercultural communication. Next up as a barrier is the combination of race, skin color, and ethnicity. We do know that the world has had a history of white supremacy. That may be putting it a bit strongly, but basically the color of your skin, the darker you get, the less advantages and chances you have in life. We know that that has largely been overcome. The election of an African American president has helped that very much in the United States, some believe. We know that along with racial discrimination and skin color and ethnicity discrimination comes this conceptual way of thinking called othering. It was referred to quite a few times in the book. Othering is where you degrade those who are outside of your culture, like referring to Korean people as Orientals, a term that I mentioned last time is used to describe people who are inferior that were to the east of Britain. And there are lots of terms in the past that are, easy to be unproud of, that were pejorative terms used to describe race, skin color, and ethnicity. A few of them include Jew. Just saying Jew with a certain tone connotes all kinds of negative meanings about use of money, about stinginess, etc. Spick was an old one used to refer to Hispanics and in particular Puerto Ricans. Savages was how Native Americans were referred to. The N-word, of course, is very prevalent and is experiencing somewhat of a, a re-engineering in the context of hip-hop music. Even white people have experienced pejorative terms based on their skin color, such as honky and cracker. Cracker, a term used to describe a poor white person who was eating crackers. That was their diet because they were so poor, and they became in charge of Georgia plantation owners against slaves. And south of the border, we have wetback, as used to describe Mexicans because of their swimming across the Rio Grande to try and make it to, in their view, a better life. So we're seeing a reduction in these kinds of terms, or at least we're seeing the ability to talk about them from an academic standpoint. But race, skin color, and ethnicity still present a barrier to intercultural communication. Next up is civilization. Fred Yant doesn't spend a lot of time on it. Civilization is the broadest term that we can use to describe peoples in this particular chapter. 8 different civilizations were identified: Western civilization, Confucian civilization, Japanese civilization, Islamic civilization, Hindu civilization, Slavic Orthodox civilization, Latin American civilization, African civilization. Those are the 8 major categories. I'm not really sure I agree with that grouping. Some include religions, some don't. Some include a particular state like Japanese, some don't, like Confucian. So I'm not really sure I agree with that. But we do know that there have been titanic struggles between the West and the East, for example. And if you come from the West, you tend to believe that your ideas are more modern, more progressive than those from the East, which would be more, those people would be more considered usually more traditional, more mysterious. Next up as a barrier is the nation state, spoken about as the last barrier in this chapter. And really, when you talk about the nation state, you should consider nationalism and national pride. When you have an Olympic ceremony, the national anthems are sung from all nations, but when you feel that national anthem of the United States in front of you, do you feel a kind of a feeling of superiority, or does it just make you feel internally good to be an American? If you have an honest assessment, sometimes it's easy to feel a bit superior as an American. That's exactly what nationalism is all about. It's believing that your nation is superior to other nations because of your ways of the world. And when we talk about American exceptionalism, for example, that's a kind of nationalism. And America has contributed a lot of great things to this world and still continues to do so. But when you look at the United States, there are still lots of problems. You can't go down 2nd Street, even here in a small town in Stroudsburg, at night at 2 a.m. in the morning without fear for your life or fear for being robbed. And certainly a walk in Central Park would bring on the same feeling at 2 or 3 in the morning. So are we a nation where you always feel safe? I don't think so. So nationalism is really a recognition that there is no one greatest country in the world. All countries have advantages and disadvantages, and it's important to assess those objectively. Next, the book goes into various threats that can impede intercultural communication, one of which is threats to culture, which for some reason Fred Yant defines largely as products coming into your culture from another culture that you perceive as weakening that culture. Products coming in from another country that you perceive as weakening your own culture. I can remember walking around China and I thought to myself, everywhere I walk, something's missing here. What is missing from the selection of shops? I figured it out. It was the pharmacy. The pharmacy is a very interesting store that we have in the United States. It sells a lot of things. It used to sell cigarettes. It sells a lot of things from snacks, if you go in your average CVS, to pharmaceutical pills. So we have a lot of people going to a pharmacy on an almost daily basis, picking up prescriptions to cure ailments ranging from anxiety to overweight problems to allergies. And they are treating those with compressed pills that you buy, and there's a large profit being made off of those by the pharmaceutical companies. In China, I couldn't find a pharmacy because Chinese medicine is about holistic medicine. It's about curing yourself with the kind of stuff that's behind me here. It's using nature. It's using herbs. It's using liquids that come out of trees. It's using what nature naturally grows, like instead of taking a sleeping pill, taking ginseng to try and help you get to sleep. And so the threat to culture that's spoken about in this book is if China were to allow pharmacies in, that would be perceived to be degrading the culture. I also, by the way, found no adult bookstores, no XXX video shops in China. That's perceived as a threat. A product of pornography is seen as a threat to Chinese values and culture. So that's the way that threats to culture is perceived by Fred Yant. Next up is threats to the environment. And, there's a lot of threats to the environment. The whole idea of sustainability is what we're talking about on a worldwide scale, although the book defines it differently than we do here at ESU. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking not so much about using resources so it doesn't compromise the future. That's what the book talks about. What we talk about when we talk about sustainability, and I'm on the Sustainability Commission, is if you are going to do damage to the environment, that you also repair the environment. And so if we're going to take down a tree at ESU for a new building, then we must plant an equal tree somewhere else on the university so that the net effect is zero loss of processing of carbon dioxide into oxygen. Among the biggest contributors to the environment in terms of damaging or harming it are electronic waste. Think of how many cell phones you've had in your life and where have they gone? Have you recycled them? Have they gone to younger brothers and sisters, or have they gone in the trash? And what's inside of those? All kinds of really hazardous chemicals. Just in the battery alone, acid. There's all kinds of nasty stuff in electronic waste, cell phones, computers, televisions, all the gadgets that we have in our life. Also packaging. You go to your average takeout place, Cluck U, Burger King, wherever, and you get an incredible amount of packaging to bring home your food. And every time you go to the grocery store, same thing. Mountains of plastic bags. If you go to the pharmacy and you buy just a package of toothpaste, the toothpaste itself is in a package, and then there's a box around it, and then they put it in a bag and you take it away. And think about how much waste that is just from buying something that you want to use to clean your teeth. How contradictory is that? Also food, terrible wastage. Go to any restaurant, any family restaurant, and look at the food that's left on the plates of people when they're finished. The portions are huge, so if you run out of room in your stomach, you shouldn't eat any more, of course. But you don't find that in countries where food is more precious. We throw away all kinds of food every single day. Fuel is another one, burning fuel in our cars, burning fuel in our homes. That fuel, when it's burnt, creates carbon dioxide, which is depleting the ozone layer. And then finally, water. 90% of the water in this world is used for agricultural purposes, leaving only 10% to drink. That's why places like California have a drought restrictions in place, no watering. That's why places like Las Vegas in the middle of the desert actually pay people to rip up their lawns and put in concrete frontage, however you say it, the front of the house is concrete or pebbles or something, because water is precious. especially in the Arab world. They have desalination plants, as you know, but most of the water is coming from underground. You got to have water to survive. Next up is the threat from immigration. And we can say that in general, you have large majorities in countries across the world that want more restrictions on others, there's that term again, other peoples coming into their country, or immigrants. When you have large majorities, like in the United States, the majority is white people right now. It's going to change. We're going to have a lot more Hispanic intermingling. And actually, just to make one comment about race that I didn't get to earlier, is increasingly people don't see themselves as from a single race. They see themselves as multiracial, or at the very least biracial. At any rate, when we're talking about immigration, people are afraid of others coming in and taking something away, if you're in the majority, if you're in the status quo. Europe is more concerned about Islam threatening Christianity, or actually there's a large strain of agnosticism and atheism in Europe. They're afraid of Islam challenging that. And in the USA, it's more about Hispanics taking away jobs, Hispanics and unemployment. Although we showed earlier that Hispanics have the highest workforce employment out of any ethnicity. Now, all of this is tough to consider, except we are encouraged by the promise of new media, which Fred Yant discusses next. That email, phones, and social media are creating greater awareness. I mean, how many times in your news feed on Facebook do you see somebody that's saying, like this social cause, whether it's breast cancer awareness, for example, and then you like it, you share it, you send it on. Does it really impact people's thinking? I think that's yet to be proven, but we do know that in social media, we have a lot more ability to learn about causes. I mean, ISIS, for example, the organization, the Islamic State organization, even though it exists beyond particular boundaries in the Middle East, has recruited many people through social media, many Americans, actually. And so social media presents a contact space where people can learn more about other cultures and hopefully have some of the barriers and the misperceptions that are present reduced. Which brings us to a final word for this chapter and for this class, and that is to remind ourselves that culture does influence your perception about people, and perception is about assigning meaning to the events that you see. So when you go into Chinatown and you see the way that people are acting, or you go to a mummers parade in Philadelphia and you see the way that people are acting, or you go to another country and you see people doing different things. My wife is in Moscow, Russia right now. She's flying to Greece with my daughter for a graduation for her doctorate and my daughter's high school graduation. And they're not allowed to leave the airport without a visa and a lot of fees that you have to pay. So they're stuck in Moscow airport for 12 hours. And it would be very easy to perceive of a hostility there, because actually there is a hostility between Russians and Americans. Americans charge Russians a lot of money for visas too. So there's a tit for tat going on there, a payback that's going on there. So culture, where you come from, affects your perception of others. And we know that as a result, the language that we use, the pejorative terms I mentioned earlier for racist, pejorative racist terms, for example, language and nonverbals, the way that we look at each other, roll our eyes, scoff, frown, etc., they can be barriers to intercultural communication. But hopefully now that you have taken this class, you have improved your already intercultural communication skills, your skills that you already have, I should say, have because you are an educated person. You're taking college classes and you're able to take in the information, sort through it, synthesize it, and make a fairly objective assessment, or at least realize when you're being subjective. And that's what we consider to be a critical thinking education, a liberal arts education, and that's what this class has been all about. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great rest of the summer.